as we've been doing when we've been talking about the impeachment, I have liked to have sort of give you both sides of my take on the day's event. So today, of course, is the final day. Unless this spills over into tomorrow, this was Trump's defense presentation. So he had several different attorneys today on the floor of the Senate, and they didn't spend much time getting into things. It was only about 2.5 hours. If I could be mistaken about that, but it was short. They were allotted 16 hours of time. They got it done in about 2.5 hours. And I want to just run through some of the good and the bad. In the preceding days, we've done this with the House managers, their presentation. I've done my best to say positive things and say negative things that I think are within bounds. And so I want to do the same thing today with Donald Trump and his team. So let's get into the good and the bad. Then we're going to revisit the same flow chart that we've been working through. Then we're going to get into the news. I want to talk about some of the issues that have come up today, and as well as sort of how the Trump team has narrowed the scope of their defense again. So the Democrats are really trying to expand the scope, and what Trump's defense lawyers did is really narrow it back down, and then they introduce some of their sort of stop blocks, their defense markers. And so we'll go through all of those things. So first and foremost, the good and the bad. Some of the good things that Trump and his team did. The first one I thought was very good is they showed this incitement language double standard. So they played a lot of clips, a lot of clips, a lot of compilations that the media is not happy about, but I thought were very effective in showing that there's this massive double standard when it comes to defining what incitement means. The Democratic claim thus far has been Donald Trump used the word fight like hell or you're not going to have a country anymore, use that phrase. And that was something that was in the original article of incitement. We talked about it. They also said, we want you to, I think there was another one, something about fighting. They were very upset about certain language that was in his Save America rally speech on January 6th. That was in the original article. The scope was very narrow, and they were upset about that language. And so today, what Trump and his team did is they had this many clips of all spliced together in sort of these supercuts where they would just go through and they would show other Democrats, other politicians, other anchors, other Congress people just sort of in the political sphere, all using very similar language. And it was very effective, I thought, in showing that this is kind of just commonplace language. This is standard political language, and it was persuasive in my mind. I think a lot of people thought it was very, very effective, myself included, because they were saying the same things. And when you see Hillary saying it and Kamala Harris saying it and Chuck Schumer saying it and on and on and on and on for like 7 minutes, 17 minutes, 14 minutes here and there, you're going, all right. It just adds some context to what Trump said. They also did some other good things. They showed that there were due process problems that were in the evidence that was submitted by the Democratic House managers. We've got a clip of that from one of Trump's attorneys, and we're going to show you sort of how he made that argument. I thought it was very effective, specifically talking about due process. In other words, this entire impeachment trial and the underlying lack of an investigation. There should have been an investigation that took place in the House of Representatives before it ever came over to the Senate. And they were just really sort of ripping that apart, that it wasn't done right. And then the evidence that was submitted yesterday by the House managers was sort of falsified. It was sort of fraudulent, and it was subpar evidence, which is the same point that we were making yesterday. They also made a good free speech defense. I thought it was very good in terms of just going it back to the originality of the First Amendment. The Democrats were trying to make this little bit of an argument I thought was intellectually dishonest, and I was disappointed about it because I believe in the First Amendment very strongly. And what they were saying yesterday is that, well, free speech is great and all, but it doesn't really apply in an impeachment proceeding. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, the Constitution, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law regarding and then we talk about all the First Amendment protections in there. And somehow the Democrats were reading that as though, well, it's okay if it's an impeachment proceeding, that you should not consider, or you should have rules or regulations or laws or the case law that says how to interpret speech in an impeachment proceeding should support not protecting that free speech. Just didn't make much sense, especially since they swore an oath to the Constitution to uphold and defend the Constitution. So what we saw today from Trump and his defense team, I thought was effective. They did actually cite some case law. It actually was sort of a good, and you're going to see it as a bad below, because the presentation of the defense, I think for most of the public, was probably pretty boring, right? He was talking about case law. He was going through some of the legal analysis that came from those cases. And even when I was listening to it, I was like, okay, I'm a legal guy. I like to listen to this stuff just in general, but I'm thinking to myself, all right, this is very pertinent, but it is more boring than some of the other stuff that we have seen. And so kind of a good, kind of a bad. They also did not volunteer evidence to the senators, which I thought was kind of a smart play. May not be so good in the court of public opinion, but I thought from a legal perspective, I thought it was very good. And we're going to see what I'm talking about here. I have a clip from this. It was just actually recently asked this afternoon. I think it was Bernie Sanders, in fact, actually asked a question. I don't know if I have a clip of it yet because I just watched it, but Bernie Sanders asked a question and it sort of got contentious, and one of Trump's lawyers was responding to him and basically saying it's not relevant here. I'm not going to answer that. It's totally not relevant. And it's a good question if you're not in a trial. It's a good question. It should have been asked during an investigation, which should have taken place in the House of Representatives before the day of the trial. But the trial was today. They get to ask clarifying questions. They don't get to do an investigation in the middle of a trial. We'll dive into that a little bit more. And another good thing I thought in terms of legality, a good legal strategy was they kept it very, very short. And you'll see this down here. I think it's also something that's bad. The reason it was good is because I think they probably made a good calculation that this was not good for them. This was not good for Republicans. This was not good for Trump. The longer this thing went on from a defense perspective, the worse it was. And they wanted to get it done and get it over with quickly. I also thought it was good because they know that they're going to win this thing. They know that the Republican senators are not going to cross the aisle and vote to convict Donald Trump. So why would you sort of belabor the point? Why would you let this thing go on and on and on and just drone on when all that's probably going to do is just agitate some of your jurors and you want them to rule in your favor? So they just said, okay, enough. We presented our case. You heard our points. They kept it short, sweet, and concise, and they are just moving on with it. So that was why that was good. Now let's talk about the bad. As I mentioned, I thought that some of the legal procedural arguments are boring. I mean, they're just boring. So you got to think about the two audiences here. Some of the arguments that we heard from Trump and his team were lawyerly arguments. They were the type of arguments that you would present to a judge. When you're presenting to a jury, you don't go in there and you talk about case law and statutes and citations and sort of navigate through the legal analysis in front of a jury because they're not lawyers. Their eyes would glaze over. They'd be bored out of their minds. That's why you get into emotional arguments and you get out there and you do what the Democrats did yesterday and the day before that. You talk a lot of emotion and you blow everything out of proportion and you make everything seem like it's the end of the world. We saw a lot of that, a lot of doom and gloom, a lot of look how close Pence was, look how close Romney was, look how devastating this is to American democracy. And that's persuasive. It's effective. It's a lot more interesting. People will be more engaged versus another lawyer who comes out and says, well, in Woods versus, Smith, there was this thing that they talked about and the court said this and they analyzed these 5 factors and it goes on. A guy like me, I'm like, yeah, that's great. This is substantive legal analysis. But you got to remember, this is a trial in the Senate. It's a political show trial, in my opinion, and it's something where the American people are watching this. So they're not making arguments to the judge. They're not even really making arguments to the senators so much as they are making arguments that the media is going to run with and the American people will ultimately decipher as it comes through the media filter. So, in terms of I think making a solid legal case, it was very effective, but in terms of winning in the court of public opinion, I thought not so good, not so effective. The clips also were very repetitive. We saw a number of clips that were just sort of, stacked together, and we saw some of the same clips, I think, replayed a few times. I think I heard from Hillary a couple times. I also heard from Chuck Schumer, the same actual clip that we used to impeach him in our impeachment template. That was played a few times, I think, at different parts throughout the presentation. I think a couple different attorneys played it. So a little bit repetitive. It's not the end of the world, but it would have been, I think, a little bit more effective. I noticed it. I think other people probably did as well. There was also some pretty aggressive posture at times from Trump's attorney. And actually, Jonathan Turley posted this on Twitter. He flagged it, and I saw this. We have a clip from, I think it was Vanderween, one of Trump's defense attorneys, Vanderween, who was really getting agitated about it. And I think a question was just read into the record, and he responded. He goes, who asked that question? Wondering what senator had actually asked that. And Bernie Sanders, to his credit, fired right back. He goes, I did. That's my question. What do you have to say about that? And then Van der Ween just turned around and said, well, listen, basically it's outside the scope. You know, it's a relevant question. And the question had to do with, I think, did you think the election was stolen? Does Trump think the election was stolen? And he goes, who asked that question? And then Bernie, I did. And he said, well, that's irrelevant. We're not talking about that. We're talking about incitement. Okay, that's the scope of what we're talking about here. I know you guys want to talk about everything else, but that's not the point. Okay, the scope is limited to the article of impeachment and to the issues in front of the court. And so it was a little bit contentious. You know, I'm not so sure that is an effective thing to sort of do with a room full of senators. These people are already egomaniacs. They already think that the whole world is beholden to them. And so to have some, podunk attorney in their minds come in there and sort of give them some attitude, I'm not sure that fares real well. But as I said, I don't think that this is something where that type of behavior would ultimately impact the outcome. And so right now you're also thinking of that attorney's posture as being a political statement. Right now he's doing that probably to make his client feel good, right? To go out there and say, being more aggressive to make sure that Trump is watching the performance and is happy with his posture. The other thing, as I mentioned, where I said it was a good thing that it was kept very short. It was good legally. I think probably not so good publicly, right? The public was probably expecting a lot more. We saw yesterday basically 2 full days. I think the Democrats used 14 of their 16-hour allotment. Trump and his team, they used 2.5 hours, right? And so if you're somebody on the other side, you may have been expecting a lot more. You may have been wanting to see a point-by-point rebuttal, and you may have wanted a lot more meat and potatoes around the bone. And we just didn't see that there. So, from my perspective, I thought it was a good thing that it was short from a tactical legal perspective, but in the court of public opinion, it may have been better to just continually dunk on the Democrats if they had more material to do that, or to answer more questions if they weren't going to be dunking on the Democrats, to just sort of, be a little bit more open and responsive to additional questions. Again, I think that's a PR, public relations type of question. I still think that on the weight of things, keeping it short and moving on was a better decision. All right, so let's take a look at the flow chart that we've been working through. As I mentioned at the start of this impeachment proceeding, if I were a prosecutor, this is sort of how I would prosecute the impeachment against the president. And these red blocks are the stops. These are the defenses. And largely we saw a lot of this stuff. They didn't refer to it that I heard of by the Brandenburg test. But the defense to the incitement was, Donald Trump it wasn't incitement. I mean, it wasn't technically or legally incitement. We heard some law read into the record, but really this was rebutted by some of the videos that they played, that basically Trump's language is the exact same language that other Democrats and other politicians and other anchors have used. Therefore, it's not incitement. It's also benign political speech, which sort of carried over, it's a separate issue, but political speech in terms of the First Amendment defense. Yesterday, we saw a pre-rebuttal from Joe Negussi, and he was saying, free speech doesn't apply in impeachment proceedings. And today, they had a pretty forceful sort of justification that free speech is included. The Supreme Court has said that. They actually referenced, I think, 2 cases into the record. So I think they did a nice job of buttressing that Trump was utilizing free speech. We also saw that there was some talk about causation. In other words, Trump did not ultimately cause this. There was premeditation. This was stuff that would have happened even if Donald Trump, had not said those words. We talked a little bit about that. And then sort of negligence. We kind of talked about that just in terms of kind of what the other Democrats have been doing and saying. In other words, the entire volume of the political environment is so elevated that it's damaging from both sides, right? The government is kind of being negligent. And they talked, I think, about Mayor Bowser, and they said, there other people who were in charge of making sure the Capitol Hill was secured, they were negligent. They were refusing additional help from federal resources that would have been there to provide additional security to prevent something like this from happening. And, largely it kind of followed that same structure. They did it very rapidly. We saw a lot of video, a lot of media, good use of media today. And as we have been experimenting with yesterday and the day before that, I also wanted to mention the scope. So remember the scope that we left on yesterday. When I talk about the scope, specifically, we sort of start in the middle with the article of impeachment, and we were adding in a lot of the other issues that were not in the original articles, but the Democrats wanted to talk about, and they just packed that full in their 74-page memorandum. Then yesterday, we saw even more stuff was crammed in the scope, specifically issues about Russia, China. Trump's going to do this again. We saw, MAGA is dangerous for the foreseeable future, and it just sort of looked like this. We started here in the middle, then the Democratic memorandum really buttressed the additional issues and expanded the scope. And then yesterday we saw that again. Well, Donald Trump and his team today, they just got rid of all that other stuff. They really spent a lot of time talking about these two questions. We won by a landslide, which the Democrats are calling the big lie. And also, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So I didn't see much about the Raffensperger phone call, a little bit about it, but most of the time was spent here. And these were some of the main claims they used to sort of put the stop signs in the road. They really wanted to get aggressive. They said no due process here. There was no causation. It was not actually incitement, and it really was free speech. And so let's get into the happenings that took place today, now that we have sort of a framework on where we're coming from. And when if you recall, earlier in the week, we were going through the Washington Post updates. We were literally, they have this live update panel, and I took this screenshot today, and it was very, very wild just to see the tone of the change in how this stuff is being reported by the Washington Post. I went back to the Washington Post. We've been using them all week, and I wanted to go back and use them today, but the nature of the coverage has just been 100%, in my opinion, adverse to Trump, right? So now they're saying Trump team shows selectively edited videos of Democrats urging a fight. And this is very interesting, the selectively edited video part, because what we're going to see here in these upcoming slides is one of his defense lawyers' claims here was the Democrats were selectively editing their videos. And so he actually made this whole point. He had a whole presentation about it, that they were not presenting the full context of the things that were being said. They were selectively edited. And so he actually had, as part of his presentation today, an argument that they selectively manipulated the evidence that they were submitting to the trial. And so the Washington Post turns around and says, no, you were selectively editing it. So, you see just a lot of language here that we didn't see yesterday. When the Democrats were presenting, the headlines were very much in their favor. Here today, you'll see things like, well, first of all, they think Tucker Carlson is going to be a major threat to democracy now. We also see, we got sort of a sympathy story, look what Trump did. 2 officers are dead. 199 legal experts say the Senate must not acquit. We've got, as I said, selectively edited videos. Down here, we have Democratic senators pan Trump's defense arguments, plainly a distraction, they say. Trump lawyer defends former president's phone call with Georgia's Secretary of State. Trump did not cause the riots, says his lawyer. And then they add in this little blurb. Who doesn't mention the ex-president's invitation for his supporters to come to D.C.? Right. So they say, oh, it's a little bit of reporting, but then they just add a whole argument here. Oh, by the way, Trump said that he didn't cause the riots, but he didn't mention that he invited them down to D.C., by the way. You're going, come on, can you just report what's going on? Or do you have to add in your little commentary every step of the way? So let's take a look at what Washington Post has on there right now. This is live. Lawyers conclude their case. Senators ask questions. Trump lawyer dismisses the claims as hearsay, very much concerned about Pence. Raskin asks, how gullible do you think we are? Trump lawyer declines to say whether or not they won the election. Republican senators are targeting wavering colleagues. So, a lot of the same tone. Fight was just a political speech, his defense team says. All right, so let's go back to our slides. And they were very upset about this selective editing video, the selective editing issue that came up today. This was from the Washington Post earlier today at 1:43. Lawyers for the Donald Trump team concluded their defense after accusing House impeachment managers of being motivated by hatred for Trump and showing selectively edited video of Democrats using the word fight as they sought to downplay the former president's role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The defense lawyers, who also argued his speech was protected by the First Amendment, allotted 16 hours for their presentation, but only used 2 hours and 32 minutes. And then senators would get the opportunity to ask questions. So, as I mentioned, there are a couple headlines throughout the internet, some other postings on Twitter. People were upset about this selectively edited video because it was very effective, I think. And this was interesting that they sort of use this word. They're pretty good at this. They'll do this a lot. They'll say that something that you did was wrong, even though they did it or they'll take something that was effective from you and they'll sort of manipulate the argument and they'll say, no, that was wrong. So here, I'm being inarticulate about this. Here's the point. One of Trump's lawyers made the case today, made an argument on the Senate floor in the trial today that said basically they were submitting fraudulent evidence to you. Okay, they added a blue check mark where there wasn't a blue check mark. They were manipulating dates. They were taking certain videos out of context. And so as soon as that presentation was over, they played a separate video that did have a bunch of selectively edited clips. I mean, we got to be candid about that. But it's not any different than what the Democrats did yesterday. And so what the Washington Post reports is, well, Trump and his team, they use selectively edited videos. They're not even reporting the fact that the entire argument was about the Democrats using selectively edited videos. And so they're saying that Trump and his team were doing something improper, but the basis of their argument was that they did it first. And so it's just the massive double standard continues. It's almost comical if it wasn't so serious. But here is Trump's lawyer today.
You get more due process than this when you fight a parking ticket. One reason due process is so important with respect to evidence offered against an accused.
Hey, so quick note on that. I did speed this up rapidly. It's at 1.75 speed, but he slows down a little bit, and I think you'll be able to understand it.
You get more due process than this when you fight a parking ticket. One reason due process is so important with respect to evidence offered against an accused is that it requires an opportunity to test the integrity, the credibility, the reliability of the evidence. Here, of course, former President Trump was completely denied any such opportunity. And it turns out there is significant reason to doubt the evidence the House managers have put before us. Let me say this clearly. We have reason to believe the House managers manipulated evidence and selectively edited footage. If they did, and this were a court of law, they would face sanctions from the judge. Yep. I don't raise this issue lightly. Rather, it is a product of what we have found in just the limited time we have had since we first saw the evidence here with you this week. We have reason to believe that the House managers created false representations of tweets, and the lack of due process means there was no opportunity to review or verify the accuracy. Consider these facts. The House managers, proud of their work on the snap impeachment, staged numerous photo shoots of their preparations. In one of those, Manager Raskin is seen here at his desk reviewing two tweets side by side. The image on his screen claims to show that President Trump had retweeted one of those tweets. Now, members of the Senate, let's look closely at this screen, because obviously Manager Raskin considered it important enough that he invited the New York Times to watch him watching it. Now, what's wrong with this image? Actually, there are three things very wrong with it. Look at the date on the very bottom of the screen on Manager Raskin's computer screen when we zoom into the picture. The date that appears is January 3rd, 2020, not 2021. Why is that date wrong? Because this is not a real screenshot that he's working with. This is a recreation of a tweet, and you got the date wrong when you manufactured this graphic. You did not disclose that this is a manufactured graphic and not a real screenshot of a tweet. Now, to be fair, the House managers caught this error before showing the image on the Senate floor, so you never saw it when it was presented to you.
Yeah, so in a court of law, that is a big deal, right? In a real court, that's a pretty big deal. Unless something happens, if you catch the other side manipulating evidence, you might say this is pretty minor. But if you're literally changing dates and recreating evidence, and it's not the original thing, and you're not disclosing that to the court, that's a huge problem. I mean, massive problem. There would be a big issue with that. So people are up there saying, well, it's just the date they recreated it. They just moved some things around. It's Photoshop and everything like that. That's kind of the point, right? Is there is no legitimacy or credibility behind any of the evidence that was presented. It is just stuff that is being manipulated. It is just the Democrats moving things around. Now, it may be minor, it may be inconsequential in their perspective, but this is not how things work in a regular court of law. You don't just get to go to a judge and say, oh yeah, well, I kind of swore under oath that it's an exhibit. I'm testifying to the court that this is true and authentic. I know where it came from. I got a good chain of custody. I can prove it all. We can backdate it. We can verify where it came from. We can authenticate the document. I just manipulated it a little bit. Sorry about that, Judge. And the judge goes, oh, it's just the date. You're just moving some text around. No problem. Never would happen. That would be a big, big problem. And so he rightfully points that out. Now, it wasn't just with that one clip. He also says that there was some House manager that said that this woman's a tweet, which was presented in front of the House as Jennifer Lynn Lawrence, they gave her this blue check mark. Okay, well, in reality, she doesn't have that. She does not have a blue check mark. So why are they doing that? Why are they manipulating evidence? And again, you may say it's just a blue check mark. It's kind of a big deal, right? They're trying to make her claim look more legitimate than it is. Okay, I don't necessarily agree that a blue check mark makes something more legitimate, but that's why it exists. But that's why people get it. It's verified. It looks more prestigious. That's why people go through the whole process of getting one. And so for them to manipulate the evidence like that, it's manipulation. And if you can manipulate one bit of evidence, who's to say they didn't manipulate other bits of evidence? Same story here. So that attorney just went on and he had two examples. I'm not going to play the video clips here, but he showed specifically, he said he sort of had these two videos playing side by side, and this was from the Fine People hoax, where this was sort of one of the biggest, crocs of baloney that I've ever seen. But they were saying that Trump was racist based on this video clip where he was saying, there were, quote, fine people on both sides of the aisle, when he said, I totally disavow the Nazis and the white supremacists and all that stuff. Well, when the House managers played their video, they cut it off. And so he starts in this, he plays this video, and he says they stopped right here when you have good people on both sides, which is what he said. They stopped it right there, and he just played the rest of the video where Trump finishes his thought and said, look, I condemn them totally, but you got to understand there are good people who do think that taking down a part of governmental history is a problem. He says the Nazis, the white supremacists, I condemn them totally. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the other people. He says, what are you going to do? Take Washington down? You're going to take Jefferson down? And so they took the whole thing out of context. In other words, they selectively edited the video, and he just came back out and he said, look, this is exactly what they did. He made the same point over here where he says that the House managers cut the video here, where basically there were several cuts in this video. So they were clipping from Trump's speech over to the crowd speech and to Trump's speech and over to crowd speech. And he was just showing that things were selectively edited going back and forth. And then as soon as he's done presenting it, what does the Washington Post do? They make a post and they say, Trump and his team were selectively editing videos. You're going, oh my, did you guys watch it? Because he was just accusing your team of doing that same thing. Of course, I say that the Washington Post is on the side of the Democrats based on their political commentary for how they cover the news. So there is a concept in the law called the doctrine of completeness. I want to show you what that looks like. This came over from Cornell Law School, the Legal Information Institute, under Rule 106 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, and this is for civil procedure. I'm going to show you what Rule 106 looks like here in a second. It says, when part of a writing or a recorded statement is introduced, an adverse party may require introduction of any other part or any other writing or recorded statement which ought in fairness to be considered contemporaneously with the writing or recorded statement originally introduced. This additional evidence is called explanatory evidence. Its purpose is to qualify, explain, or put in context the original piece of introduced evidence. The explanatory writing does not have to be part of the same writing or recording. Additionally, even otherwise inadmissible evidence, such as hearsay, can be admissible under this rule if it is necessary to correct any confusion or wrongful impression created by the admission of the original evidence. Okay, so these are things that we talk about in the law. Here is actually Rule 106. It says specifically, a very short rule, if a party introduces all or part of a writing or recorded statement, an adverse party may require the introduction at that time of any other part or any other writing or recorded statement that in fairness ought to be considered at the same time. And so, it's a rule. This has been thought through before, this selective editing argument. And in this trial, both sides are doing it because nobody's really following any rules. It's just a political bunch of nonsense. There is rules and procedures for this. The Democrats selectively edited videos yesterday. That was a part of Trump's actual argument. They played evidence about that today. And in a regular trial, the Democrats would have never been able to play what they played. The Republicans or Trump and his team would have never been able to play what they played because it's all hearsay, incomplete evidence. It's all political nonsense. The whole thing is a joke. It's not following any rules. But now the double standard is coming back into play. Now the Washington Post and other people on the internet are saying this was selectively edited. They did something so egregious when the entire crux of the argument was that, hey, you guys did it first. So that they were very upset about it. They're still very upset about it. This is a portion of, I think it's 1 minute and 42 seconds. I'm not sure we're going to listen to the whole thing, but this is what they were upset about. This is the video itself.
They're fighting, or I'm fighting. We're both fighting.
We will fight back. We're not going to just take this line down.
I'm just going to keep the fight up.
What we have to do right now is fight as hard as we can.
We have to rise up and fight back.
And so we're going to fight, and we're going to continue to fight.
I'm going to be fighting like hell.
We keep fighting, or we kept fighting, and we did. So we're going to keep fighting.
We have to be fighting every single day.
We have to fight back, and we have no choice but to do that. I think we're doing the right thing to do that.
Fighting.
And I'm fighting.
Well, our job right now is to fight.
It's really important. I'm going to keep fighting.
I'm asking for the support of people across the country to fight back.
And you got to be fierce in fighting.
Keep fighting.
Brown have been fighting.
I've told President Biden I will Fight like mad.
I'll tell you what, now more than ever, we have to fight like hell.
We have these battles on the floor of the Senate. I'm going to go down and battle, and I'm going to be down there on the floor fighting.
Right. But we Democrats are fighting as hard as we can. Democrats are fighting as hard as we can. Credit it in any way, but we're fighting back.
What we've got to do is fight in Congress, fight in the courts, fight in the streets, fight online, fight at the ballot box.
Fighting and pushing around the clock fighting. Continue to be brave and be strong and keep fighting. We're getting people engaged in the fight. We're fighting. We've got to keep fighting and keep focused. Continue to fight.
This is going to be a fight.
We'll also fight him and challenge him in every way that we can, in the Congress, in the courts, and in the streets.
To continue fighting, we each have an important role to play in fighting. In this fight, like so many before it, it has been a fight. The American people are going to have to fight. And about the importance of fighting, I will always fight. Fighting. But we always must fight. Joe Biden has a deep, deep-seated commitment to fight and to fight, and about the importance of fighting. We always must fight, to fight, to fight, and to fight. As our willingness to fight, continue the fight, as Joe Biden says, to fight. It's about fighting of what we're fighting for.
Yikes, right? I mean, it just went on, and it went on for like another 10 minutes, I think, that one. There were so many of them. I think one went for 13 minutes, 5, 7 minutes. I mean, it was a lot. And they just had just clip after clip after clip. And this, there were some other really good ones in there. They had one where I think Elizabeth Warren went on and on and on. Hillary Clinton was in it. There was a whole nother segment like that about stolen election, challenging the election, about objecting to the electoral votes. Even Raskin was back there in 2017, objecting to the votes. We had the other woman, I can't remember her name right now, but a lot of people were doing it back then in 2017. It was like supercut after supercut after supercut. And in my opinion, just extremely effective. A lot of people on the conservative Twitterverse were just sort of doing cartwheels over it. I wasn't as over the top as some individual, I don't think, but I thought that this was particularly well done. And it didn't sit well. They were pretty upset about it. You can typically tell how the Trump side did based on, I think, what the response from the media looks like. And the Washington Post was obviously very aggressive in their version of reporting the facts of today. It was a lot of political commentary wrapped into their headlines, and they were sort of making the argument against Trump's defense lawyers in their reporting. So that's how you know it's effective. The other way that you know it's effective is because suddenly the calls of racism are out there. So you just watch that video. There was Chuck Schumer, there was Cory Booker, there was who else was there? Was a lot of other people in there, right? Kind of a whole slew of individuals there. White people, black people, males, females, a lot of Democrats throughout the ages have used that type of language. We saw, Joaquin Castro, who's a Hispanic man, and on and on and on. But Stacey Plaskett today, one of the first questions that she asked, or one of the first issues she brings up, is that it was a lot of black women and a lot of people of color. So as soon as the argument starts to get away from her, it's just like an automatic defense to just suddenly just shout racism towards Trump. Trump has been accused of racism for 4.5 years, 5 years now, longer than that. And so her response to the defense is that the defense is racist by playing this video. And the defense, they work for Trump, so obviously they have to be racist, right? Here is Stacey Plaskett on the floor of the Senate today.
The defense counsels put a lot of videos out in their defense, playing clip after clip of black women talking about fighting for a cause or an issue or a policy. It was not lost on me as so many of them were people of color and women, black women like myself, who are sick and tired of being sick and tired for our children.
Incitement.
Your children. Our children. This summer, things happened that were violent. But there were also things that gave some of us black women great comfort. Seeing Amish people from Pennsylvania standing up with us, members of Congress fighting up with us. And so I thought we were past that. I think maybe we're not.
Honestly, I have no idea what the heck she's even talking about. So apparently she's trying to equate what happened with the Capitol with stuff back during the summer unrest. And, I guess Trump playing a video to respond to the Democrats playing videos. They can't include black women in their videos, or what? I mean, I don't understand what the point was. I think it was just a bizarre excuse to make this a racial thing. I don't know how it became a racial thing, but everything is a racial thing these days. So the other big complaint that I saw from a lot of people on the left today on Twitter was that Trump and his team didn't know how to respond when they asked him about when he knew that Mike Pence was in danger. So a lot of these questions, I've been critical about this throughout the week, really, is what the Democrats have been trying to do is make this whole thing about the harm and the damage and about after the fact, right? As soon as the Capitol was breached, look at all the chaos. Look at all the damage. Look how close they were to getting Pence. Look how close they were to getting Romney. We got it. But what does that have to do with the cause of that madness? We're there for incitement of an insurrection. Okay, so we got to figure out what caused that. And they really weren't talking about it. Today, they were bringing up questions about, well, when did Trump know about Pence and what did he do about it? And to their credit, Trump's defense lawyers, they just turn around and basically say it's not relevant. It's not relevant. The Democrats haven't presented any evidence about that. Ask them when the timeline was. So we'll get into this. Let's listen in on what happened on the floor.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? And what specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Mr. Van Veen?
The House managers have given us absolutely no evidence one way or the other onto that question. We're able to piece together a timeline, and it goes all the way back to December 31st, January 2nd. There is a lot of interaction between the authorities and getting folks to have security beforehand. On the day, we have a tweet at 2:38, so it was certainly sometime before then. With the rush to bring this impeachment, there's been absolutely no investigation into that. And that's the problem with this entire proceeding. The House managers did zero investigation, and the American people deserve a lot better than coming in here with no evidence, hearsay on top of hearsay on top of reports that are of hearsay. Due process is required here, and that was denied.
Mic drop, walks away. Look at that. Love it. Beautiful. So he's exactly right. He's 100% right. Here, this would be similar to, like, let's say you're in a murder trial and they haven't proven that your client did anything. They haven't been able to prove it. They go to trial, the trial's coming to a close, and one of the jurors or one of the prosecutors in this case, somebody who was there, somebody who is going to vote to incriminate your client, they ask, okay, well, defense lawyer, where did your client hide the murder weapon? Is he willing to share that? And you go, I'm not telling you anything. It's not our job to tell you to help make your case. You had several weeks to prepare your investigation, to do your due diligence. You didn't do any of it. Now you're coming in here and you want to ask us questions about facts, about what Trump did. That's not what this proceeding is for. You could have held a commission. You could have held some sort of inquiry. I think Nancy Pelosi was calling for some sort of a investigation that was analogous to the 9/11 Commission. And they could have done that. They didn't do that. Now, the day of trial, they're saying, hey, where's the murder weapon? What did he do after that? We're kind of struggling over here. Can you give us some more evidence that maybe we can use over here so we can get back on track? And his attorney, rightfully so, just said, no, we're not talking about it. There's no due process. He said the House impeachment managers haven't told us anything. Go back to them. Ask them. They're the investigators. They're the prosecutors here. They're the one who want the impeachment to happen. They should figure it out. Ask them. And then on Twitter, everybody's saying, I can't believe this. Donald Trump and his attorneys didn't respond to that. They're not going to answer the senator's questions. No, they're not. The defense doesn't have to do that. We are defense attorneys. We don't have to help the government in their case. They can get the evidence and they can bring it forward. If they can't, then sorry, tough luck. figure it out, right? That's how this process works. And so a lot of these legal scholars, these armchair lawyers out there are just sort of throwing their hands up in the air. This is just typical. Donald Trump is such an evil person. He's not even going to give us the dignity of answering questions. No, folks, it's a trial. That's it. Bring the evidence or don't. You had plenty of time to do it. You wanted to rush this through. There really was no due process, as his attorney mentioned. And so tough luck. Don't have to answer any of those questions. And good for his attorneys for sticking to that. All right, so a recap on everything. Good was they really, I think, decimated the incitement stuff. A lot of those clips were very damning. It's obviously political language. There was no incitement. It's protected by political speech. All very, very good. There were due process problems, as we just heard. A lot of evidence was sort of manipulated. It was all reports on reports. We saw documents being submitted from CNN as evidence, apparently, even though they were written right after the fact. There was a story about Officer Sicknick being killed. They introduced that as evidence, as a footnote in their memorandum. Now they can't bring a case. They can't prove that case, it looks like. They may be able to later down the line, but they said he was murdered with a fire extinguisher because he had a huge gash in his head. That was evidence in their memorandum, and that's just not fact. It's not a fact and evidence anymore. So no real due process, no real investigation. They did a good job of not giving in to the senators. I could see attorneys just saying, a different strategy of saying, well, yes, Senator, I know it's an important question. We're going to answer that for you. They didn't. They just said, sorry, tough. That's not a good question. Go ask the House managers about it. And so it's mostly done at this point in time. I thought a very effective day for Trump and his team. Let's take a look at the Washington Post yet again to see where we're at, see if we have any news on any of this. Tensions rise as senators question Trump's lawyers. Let's take a look at the New York Times. See what they've got. Trump wraps up the brief. Senators complete questions, setting up likely Saturday vote. So we'll get into that tomorrow, it looks like. So that was it for Trump's impeachment defense team. Largely effective day.